This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I'm Karen Beach, and welcome to the Journey Step by Step podcast. This is going to be an episode of Getting Biblical, or what I like to say, Gettin' Biblical. But I don't have any guests. Normally, Terry Sendejas is my partner in crime when it comes to Bible study episodes. I feel more comfortable doing Bible study if I have someone with me. But today, I'm doing something that the Lord put on my heart to share. And if you're single, you'll definitely want to listen. But wait, if you aren't single, listen anyway. I know you know someone who is single, and even if you don't, we're going to delve into the book of Ruth, and we're going to have a good time doing it. Now, as for me, I've been single all my life. That's been a long time. I'm not going to tell you how long, but pretty long. Now, I have friends that are in strong, happy Christian marriages. Not easy marriages, because I don't think any marriage is easy, but God-ordained marriages. And to me, that's the goal. That's what I'm looking for. But I also know people who wanted the wedding more than the marriage. It was all about the size of the ring, how big the cake was, how many people they could cram into a church to watch them walk down the aisle in their dream dress. The husbands were really just something they could plop in to their dream wedding scene. It's not surprising that many of these couples are still paying off the wedding when they start paying for the divorce. Sadly, I know people who followed their hearts, which is always a dangerous proposition. And they married the man they loved, despite the fact that this man couldn't hold a job or be faithful, or more importantly, didn't care about their faith. In the worst case scenarios, there was abuse. But for some reason or another, despite the waving of many red flags, they got married anyway. And when marriage didn't change things, because it never does, but when marriage didn't change things, they did what a lot of us do when trouble rears its ugly head. They prayed. They weren't praying before marriage, weren't praying for the right spouse, but after they picked out a spouse, they then prayed and oftentimes wondered why God wasn't working. Now, at this point, they wanted God in their marriage, but he wasn't in the relationship before the marriage, during the dating, during the courtship. Now, I'm not one to say that God can't change things, because I know that God can and does do wondrous works, even in the worst circumstances. But let's be clear, he wants to be in our lives, all of our lives. All of the time. We are supposed to follow him, not the other way around. We can't do what we want to do and then wait and tell God what we want him to do. That's not the way it works. Then finally, I know people who decided to do what they wanted to do, and the heck with marriage, God, or anything besides their desires. But today, I want to speak to people like me who would like a God-centered marriage, more than they want a wedding, more than they want Mr. Right Now or Mr. Wrong, or Mrs. Right Now or Mrs. Wrong. Works that way too. So I want to talk about the story of Ruth and Boaz. And it's made its way into popular culture the way a lot of things do in the 21st century, in 2019, through a meme. And you might have heard the meme I'm talking about. I've even heard preachers quote this meme. It's really funny. It gets the crowd going. But let me just tell you what it says. To all of the girls who are in a hurry to have a boyfriend or get married, a piece of biblical advice. Ruth patiently waited for her mate Boaz. While you're waiting on your Boaz, don't settle for any of his relatives. Broke ass, Boaz, lying ass, cheating ass, dumb ass, drunk ass, cheap ass, locked up ass, got good for nothing ass, lazy ass, and especially his third cousin beating your ass. Wait on your Boaz and make sure he respects your ass. Okay, it's pretty long as far as memes go, but it's also pretty inaccurate, and that's what I want to talk about. The good thing about the book of Ruth is it's pretty much a story. You know, there's some books that are hard to read and to get through, especially in the Old Testament. But Ruth isn't one of those books. Ruth tells the story of Ruth. And it really tells the story of 3 people, not just 2. Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi. Naomi was Ruth's mother-in-law. And the book is, as much as it is about the relationship between Ruth and Boaz, it's also about the relationship between Naomi and Ruth. So let's start by looking at Naomi, the mother-in-law, first. Elimelech took his wife and their 2 sons and left Bethlehem because there was a famine in the land. They settled in Moab. While in Moab, Elimelech died. Since her sons were adults, they married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Then both of Naomi's sons died. Now her daughter-in-laws were widowed just like she was. Since Naomi had no sons or no more children, she decided she would go back home to Bethlehem. Orpah and Ruth were going to go with her, but she told them, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. The best thing for you to do is to go back to your own hometown and find someone to marry you there. Orpah followed her advice and left, but Ruth decided to stay with her. Now, when Naomi returned, she left Bethlehem with a husband, 2 sons. She came back with none of them because they had all died. And when she got back, her friends couldn't believe it. They said, "Is this Naomi?" And Naomi in Ruth 1 verses 20 and 21 said, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Lord Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me, and he brought me back empty." So you can imagine the grief of losing a husband, a spouse. But compound that with the grief of losing a spouse and then losing both of your sons. So I could kind of understand why she felt kind of bitter. So that's where Naomi is when the story starts. Let's look at Ruth. Ruth is the one that decided not to go back home, but to stay with Naomi. She said in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." So Ruth pledged her loyalty to her mother-in-law. You know, the Bible says that a husband and wife must leave their families and cleave to each other. Well, the husband Ruth cleaved to was now dead, but she was still cleaving to that family, that marital family, by staying with Naomi. Now, let's talk about customs. Back in the day, the days of the Bible when this story happened, it was the custom that if one son died, his widow could marry another son. And that kid could have, or that son would have kids with her and raise those kids as his dead brothers. This way, the brothers' line could continue. But both of Naomi's sons were dead. As a young woman, still in her childbearing years, Ruth made a very difficult decision to stay with her mother-in-law, despite the fact that it could have very dire implications for her future. Because remember, at this point in time, a woman's good fortune was often tied to her ability to get married and have kids. And at this point, there was no Boaz. So Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, and they need to eat. So Ruth decided she was going to glean grains in a field. Now, what would happen is the people during the harvest season would go out and reap and pick the grains in the field. And often as they picked that grain, some would drop on the ground. And so Ruth was going to go behind the reaper. She asked permission to go behind them and pick up whatever they dropped. And that was going to be what she and Naomi ate. So she was gleaning out in the field. She started early in the morning. She was out in the field gleaning. And she came to Boaz's portion of the field and continued gleaning. Boaz saw her because Boaz is a very successful man. He is out and looking over his field, and he sees her, and he asked about Ruth. In chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, the head reaper told Boaz, "She's the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, 'Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves.' Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while." She was on a break. So the head reaper told Boaz how hard she was working and how even before she started, she asked for permission. So as Boaz probably found her attractive, but on top of that, by talking to the head reaper, he found out that she was a decent and hard-working woman. Here she was needing food. She didn't beg for it. She asked for permission to do the work that she needed to get the food that her and her mother-in-law were going to eat. So Boaz spoke to Ruth in verses 8 and 9, and he said, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Ruth bowed to him in gratitude and asked why he was so generous to her. And he told her in verse 11, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. And how you left your mother and father and the land of your birth and came to a people you did not previously know." People talk. They always have and they always will. But the loyalty that Ruth showed to Naomi got around. Her actions spoke for her. When Boaz asked around about her, all he heard were good things about her loyalty and the fact that she was a hard worker. So, let's talk about Boaz. He was a successful man. He was the owner of the field where Ruth was gleaning, and what he did not tell Ruth was that he was Naomi's brother-in-law. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, was his brother. So think about that for a second. The brother of Boaz was Naomi's husband. Together, they raised up 2 kids who were old enough to get married before they died. So Boaz wasn't a young man. He wasn't an Idris Elba or a Chris Hemsworth, which a lot of people want you to think about. Oh, wait for your Boaz, this strapping, good-looking man. There's nothing in the book about him being handsome or strapping or anything that would give that impression. Now, if you're reading about David, it tells you he was a good-looking man. David was handsome. You know, when you read the book of Esther, Esther was good-looking. So we know if the Bible says you're good-looking, if you're good-looking, the Bible will say, hey, that's a good-looking person. But it didn't say that about Boaz. So we can kind of assume he was an average-looking older man. But what Boaz was a good guy. He looked after Ruth. He told his reapers, hey, don't touch her. Stay away from her. Because a woman alone by herself in a field, it doesn't have to be biblical times to know that that can be a really pretty dangerous proposition. But he said, hey, don't touch her. And he told his reapers, don't let her glean in another field, because if she had gone to another field, she might have been molested or even worse. And then he told the reapers to leave extra grain for her to pick up. And later on, we're going to see how much he did the right thing by her, by sticking to customs and behaving according to tradition. But let's get back to the story. So Boaz has made notice of Ruth, told everyone to look out for her. Ruth has been gleaning in the fields all day, and he invited her to dinner. She ate and even had some left over. Then, guess what she did next? It says she went back to gleaning. This woman worked all day, and it was a long day. But when she got back home to Naomi, because they lived together, she had a ton of grains and leftovers from dinner to share with Naomi. And Naomi was like, where did you go today? You know, how did you get all this food? And Ruth told her about Boaz. And that's when Naomi told Ruth that he was a close relative. Now, I think it's really interesting that Boaz knew all this about her and knew exactly who she was, but didn't say a thing about being a relative. He looked out for her, and he didn't take advantage of her, and he didn't take advantage or exploit the fact that he was a relation with her. Now, that's Boaz up until this point, but I want to take a minute out and talk about Naomi and Ruth. At this point, I think we can look at the relationship between Naomi and Ruth as more of a mother-daughter relationship than a daughter-in-law-mother-in-law relationship. In fact, at several times, Naomi refers to Ruth as daughter. So like a lot of mothers, Naomi saw the potential for a love connection. So she says, Naomi, in chapter 3, verse 1, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you? that all may be well with you? In other words, Naomi wanted Ruth to get remarried and secure her future, and she saw an opportunity for her to do just that. And she told Ruth exactly what she should do to get Boaz's attention. In chapter 3, verse 3, Naomi tells her, "Wash yourself and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but not to make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you will notice the place where he lies, and you shall go, uncover his feet, and lie down. Then he will tell you what you should do." And Ruth listened. Ruth listened and followed Naomi's instructions. They had a really strong relationship. And whether it's a mother-in-law, church member, I think that all of us women can benefit from a strong relationship with a godly older woman, and men with a godly older man. Their insight, their advice, it can be priceless, as it was for Ruth. Now, mind you, I didn't say a strong relationship with any older woman, but a strong relationship with a godly older woman. Bad advice is as plentiful as sand on the beach. However, the good advice of a godly woman certainly isn't that common. So Ruth did what Naomi suggested and slept at Boaz's feet. Then verse 8 and 9, in chapter 3, "It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. He said, 'Who are you?' And she answered, 'I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative.'" In verse 10, Boaz responds, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first, by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." She was a woman of excellence, and everybody in the city knew it. So her reputation preceded her, and she put herself forward. She followed her mother-in-law's instructions and was in good standing with Boaz. So Boaz knew that if he got Ruth, and he was dumbfounded, I think, that he could get Ruth, he was getting a woman of good character, a woman that would be trustworthy and loyal. I mean, she could have gone home like Orpah and lived her life, but she made the decision to stay with Ruth. And in this one statement, we see both Boaz's generosity and Ruth's good standing. Boaz was attracted to a woman of excellence. So what made her excellent? Her loyalty and her relationship with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and her work ethic, the hard work she did in the field. Because of who she was, he was able to say in confidence, "I will do for you whatever you ask." He wouldn't have said this if he thought she was going to be greedy or manipulative or cruel. Now, when I mentioned earlier about if a son dies, his brother can marry his wife and raise her kids as his own. That is called a kinsman redeemer, because you're kinfolk and you're redeeming the line of your kin's family. Again, in biblical times, a woman's security was directly related to her marriage. So when a woman lost a husband, especially if she lost him with no kids, Legally, one of her husband's brothers or other close relative was encouraged to marry her. As a kinsman redeemer, he'd have children with her and raise those kids as if they belonged to the dead husband. This way, the deceased man's bloodline would continue. In other words, the second husband has redeemed the dead husband's bloodline. Now, Boaz, older gentleman, nice-looking younger woman, was more than happy to be Ruth's kinsman redeemer. But here's the wrench. There was one family member that was closer to the family than Boaz was. And honestly, he had first rights to any property that they had and to Ruth. So the next day, Boaz said, "Now I'm a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives." And he told her to lie down until morning. Ruth wanted Boaz. Boaz wanted Ruth. But there was one person in the way, and both of them agreed to do the right thing. Not to give in to what they wanted to do, not to circumvent the law and do whatever they wanted, but they were going to do it the right way. So what we have here are two good and godly people. Now, in the morning, Ruth got up early and went home. I think it's funny that it actually says she got up early and went home before everyone could see her. What do they call that? The walk of shame. That's what everybody would have thought it was if they would have seen Ruth getting up, wearing the same thing she had on last night, going home from Boaz's house. What's all that about? Well, it wasn't that kind of thing, but just so people wouldn't get the wrong idea, he was like, get up a little early and go home. So he didn't send her home alone, though. Or she did go home alone, but she didn't go home empty-handed. He gave her more barley to take to Naomi. And then in chapter 4, Boaz got to work. He followed the customs of the day and met with his relative in front of several witnesses. When it was just a piece of land that Naomi was selling, the relative was more than happy to take it. However, he changed his mind when he was told that it was more than land. It was also Ruth, and he would have to be the kinsman redeemer, obligated to have a child with her, raise it on behalf of his dead relative. He said, no, I'm going to pass on that because that might impact, the inheritance that I have from my family and my kids. So he cleared the way when he passed for Boaz to step in. And in verses 9 and 10, chapter 4, Boaz confirms, "You are witnesses today that I have bought the hand of Naomi and all that belongs to Elimelech and that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon." Those were her sons. "Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." He didn't do it in secret. He did it where there would be witnesses to confirm what he did. So in the end, Ruth got Boaz. She got her Boaz. But here are a few things I want to point out. Actually, here are 10 things I want to point out. Number 1, Ruth started out by being loyal to her mother-in-law even when she didn't have to. She could have just gone back to Moab. Number 2, when Ruth went into the field, She wasn't thinking about a man. She was thinking about getting food for herself and Naomi. So whenever I hear people say, Ruth waited on her Boaz, there's nothing in this book that said that Ruth was even looking for a husband. What she was looking for was food. So Ruth worked and worked hard. That's number 3. She was out there in the morning. Before she started, she asked permission. She ate dinner with Boaz and went back to work. That's a hard-working woman. When Boaz asked about her, number 4, he got a good report. Her reputation preceded her. Number 5, he was generous to Ruth and protective of her, when he could have easily just met her with indifference. Not that he had to be rude, but he could have just said whatever. But because of his generosity and his protection, we can see that Boaz was actually a really good guy. Number 6, Naomi and Ruth had a strong, close, almost mother-daughter relationship. 7, Naomi knew Boaz and thought, there could be a match here. Naomi wanted the best for Ruth. She had her best interest in heart. And I think that's important to think about the people who are giving you advice, the people that are leading you. They need to have your best interest in heart. And unfortunately, I've seen some cases where people are giving people advice and they don't have their best interest. So that's something that Ruth wanted. Number 8, Ruth listened to Naomi and took her advice. Ruth knew the type of woman Naomi was, and when Naomi gave her that advice, now this is what you gotta do to get you a Boaz. This is what she listened to. She knew her mother-in-law wasn't going to steer her wrong. Number 9, again, this is an older man, and there's no mention of him being good looking. Although when I hear a lot of women talk about, I'm waiting for my Boaz, they think it's going to be, the Old Spice guy riding in on a horse or something like that. He was successful, he was generous, but he was an older man. Let's make that clear. It wasn't the person that you might have thought she should end up with. And number 10, he and Ruth both obeyed the rules to be together. They didn't do what they wanted to do. They followed the customs of the day. As a result, Ruth gave birth to Obed. Naomi had a grandson, and the women of the city told her in chapter 4, verse 14, Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name be famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons, and she has given birth to him. Let me just tell you a little bit about the genealogy. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David, the writer of the Psalms, a king described as being after God's own heart. Jesus came from the line of David. So when you read the genealogy of Jesus, Ruth is right there, this Moabite woman. And the Moabite were pagans, the end all pagans. But this Moabite woman became part of Jesus's genealogy. When the book started, Naomi was so downtrodden that she didn't even want to be called Naomi. She said, call me Mara, which means bitter. Now she's got a dedicated daughter in Ruth and a beautiful grandson. In the beginning, Ruth had been widowed and left everything behind to follow her mother-in-law. Orpah didn't do it, and Naomi would have understood if Ruth didn't do it either. But she did. She came to Bethlehem not even looking for a husband. There is nothing in there about, well, I got to find me a man. No, that's not what she was doing. She was following her mother-in-law. She determined they needed to eat, and that's how she met Boaz. She wasn't waiting. She was working. Let that sink in. She found Boaz when she was working, not while she was waiting, but while she was working. When she was busy living her life, that's when she met this man. This man who wasn't the age and didn't look like someone she would end up with, but she looked beyond that to the character of the man. This is a good man. This is a man that can provide for me. This is a man that will protect me and care for me. And as a result, she was married and had a child. That's not what she was looking for. There's nothing in the book that says that's what she was looking for. In fact, by choosing to go with Naomi, she was putting that future, that secure future, in jeopardy. When it started, Boaz was a successful businessman. Nothing in the book said he was looking for a wife. But when he saw Naomi, he looked twice. As an older man, he just offered her grain and protection. He didn't even think about asking her to be his wife. He assumed she'd find a younger man, but she didn't. And together, Ruth and Boaz, this unlikely couple, ended up having Obed, father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David, and David being part of the lineage that led us to Jesus. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer and ended up being in the lineage of the King of Kings who redeemed us all. So, what's the point of this little story? When someone tells you they're waiting for their Boaz, remember that Ruth wasn't waiting. She was living. And that's it for this episode. More great guests to come, but for now, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go.